Ever get the feeling that some of the solutions people propose for fixing society are more like ticking time bombs?
Hmm.
Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the critique of one of those potentially explosive ideologies,
Okay.
Marxism. We'll be exploring the work of the brilliant economist Thomas Sowell, a fierce defender of individual liberty, and his powerful takedown of Marxist theory.
Okay.
His book, Marxism, Philosophy and Economic, isn't just an academic exercise. It's a passionate argument for why freedom matters. We'll be unpacking his key points and seeing why they're more relevant than ever in our world today.
So Sowell starts by laying out the basics of Marxism. The ideas of class struggle, where the working class is pitted against the owners of capital, historical materialism, which views economics as the driving force of history, and ultimately the goal of abolishing private property in the name of equality.
On the surface, those ideas sound appealing to a lot of people. Who wouldn't want a world without inequality and exploitation? But Sowell argues that these seemingly noble goals are actually based on a flawed understanding of human nature and how societies work.
He warns that instead of leading to liberation, Marxist systems ultimately restrict individual freedom and create a whole new set of problems.
Sowell really hits hard on that point about freedom.
He does.
He argues that Marxist systems, by their very nature, suppress economic liberty
Right.
by concentrating control in the hands of the state.
Instead of individuals and businesses making their own choices based on their own assessments of the market and their own incentives,
Right, yeah.
you have a centralized authority trying to plan and manage the entire economy.
And history has shown time and again that these kinds of centrally planned economies just don't work very well.
They're notoriously inefficient. They're slow to adapt to changing conditions, and they're often completely out of touch with the actual needs and desires of the people they're supposed to be serving.
One of the most interesting points that Sowell makes is about the crucial role of price signals in a free market.
Prices in a free market act like a giant information network, constantly communicating data about supply and demand. When the price of something goes up, it tells producers to make more of it because there's high demand. When the price drops, it signals that there's less demand or too much supply.
Right.
It's a self-regulating system that keeps things balanced.
But when you remove that price signal mechanism through central planning, things get out of whack very quickly.
Exactly.
You end up with situations where the central planners might decide to produce tons of something that nobody actually wants,
Right.
while basic necessities are in short supply.
This disconnect between what people actually need and what the government decides to produce leads to shortages, waste, and economic stagnation.
Right.
We've seen this happen over and over again in countries that have experimented with Marxist economic models.
And this isn't just some abstract theoretical problem. The suppression of economic freedom has real-world consequences for people's lives and their liberty in general.
Absolutely.
If you can't choose what you want to produce, what you want to buy, or how you want to earn a living, your individual freedom is severely limited.
And this goes beyond just economics. Sowell argues that suppressing economic freedom creates a domino effect that leads to the erosion of other freedoms as well.
He points to some chilling examples from history, like the Soviet Union and Maoist China.
These regimes didn't just control the economy.
Right.
They controlled almost every aspect of people's lives.
Dissent was crushed, individual rights were routinely trampled, and anyone who dared to challenge the authority of the state was met with brutal repression.
All of this was done, of course, in the name of the collective good.
It's a stark reminder that when you start down the path of limiting individual freedom in one area, it becomes easier to justify doing so in other areas.
Yeah.
Pretty soon, the very idea of individual liberty is under attack.
Sowell argues that once the government has the power to control the economy, it's only a small step to controlling everything else.
And that's why he's so passionate about defending individual liberty and limited government.
He sees these principles as absolutely essential for safeguarding human dignity and preventing tyranny.
Sowell's critique doesn't stop with the suppression of freedom under Marxist systems.
No, it doesn't.
He also takes aim at how these systems misunderstand human motivation.
One of Sowell's key points is that people are, at least to some extent, motivated by self-interest. They respond to incentives. If you work hard and create something of value, you expect to be rewarded for your efforts.
That's just basic human nature. It's something that Marxist theory often fails to grasp.
Sowell argues that when you remove the incentive for individual effort and reward, you end up undermining the very goals you're trying to achieve.
So if people aren't naturally going to be motivated to work solely for the good of the collective, How do these Marxist systems get anything done?
That's where things get really troubling.
Okay.
Because without the natural incentive of reward, these systems often resort to force and coercion to get people to work.
So instead of inspiring people to contribute and build a better society, these systems end up relying on fear and intimidation to get things done.
That's one of the darkest aspects of Sowell's critique. He argues that this reliance on force creates a climate of fear and distrust that ends up tearing apart the social fabric.
Right.
It's the opposite of what Marxism claims to be about.
This brings us to the heart of Sowell's argument: the devastating consequences of limiting freedom, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
We could talk about that more in the next part.
Sounds good.
Hey there, listeners. If you're finding value in our deep dives and want to dig even deeper, consider grabbing a copy through the Amazon link in the description below. And if you're an audiobook fan, you can dive in with a free 2-month Audible trial on us. Our gift to you. It's a great way to support the channel, explore amazing works on the go, and immerse yourself in these thought-provoking ideas. So, check out those links in the description, and thank you for supporting our work. And we'll keep the deep dives coming.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Thomas Sowell's powerful critique of Marxism. Before the break, we were discussing how Marxist systems rely on force and coercion to compensate for their flawed understanding of human motivation. Now let's explore some of the devastating consequences that flow from these systems when they restrict freedom.
One of the most significant consequences that Sowell highlights is the stifling of innovation and progress. When you remove the incentives for individual creativity, risk-taking, and entrepreneurship, you essentially choke off the very engine that drives economic growth and technological advancement.
Makes perfect sense when you think about it. Why would anyone bother to come up with new ideas or take risks if there's no potential for reward?
Contrast the dynamism of free markets with the stagnation that we've seen historically in Marxist regimes.
While capitalist countries were forging ahead with new industries, new technologies, and rising living standards, their Marxist counterparts were often stuck trying to catch up.
It's not just about technology either. This stagnation has a direct impact on the overall well-being of people living under these systems.
Sowell makes a compelling case that free markets, with their emphasis on individual initiative and competition, are simply far more effective at generating wealth and improving living standards for everyone. But what about the promise of economic equality? Didn't Marxist regimes at least succeed in eliminating those class distinctions that they were so concerned about?
That's where Sowell's analysis gets really insightful.
Okay.
He points out that, in practice, Marxist systems often end up creating a new form of inequality that's even more insidious.
Instead of having a class of capitalists, you end up with a class of party elite who control all the levers of power and enjoy privileges that are completely out of reach for ordinary citizens.
So the irony is that in trying to eliminate class distinctions, Marxist regimes often just create a new ruling class that's even more entrenched and out of touch.
Sowell provides some pretty vivid examples of this in his book, doesn't he? He talks about cases like the Soviet Union, where high-ranking party officials lived in luxury, while ordinary citizens were struggling to get by, facing constant shortages of basic necessity.
It really highlights the danger of pursuing equality through top-down control and the suppression of individual liberty.
Sowell's point is that genuine equality can't be imposed by force. It has to emerge organically from a system that respects individual rights and allows people to rise based on their own merits and efforts.
And Sowell doesn't stop there. He also explores some of the deeper moral and cultural consequences that stem from restricting freedom.
That's another crucial dimension of his critique.
It is.
Sowell argues that when you elevate collective goals above individual aspirations and responsibilities, you create a culture of dependence on the state.
You essentially incentivize people to become reliant on the government to provide for their needs instead of taking responsibility for their own lives.
Precisely.
And this, according to Sowell, erodes those essential virtues of self-reliance, hard work, personal responsibility, and initiative.
It undermines the very character traits
Right.
that are necessary for individuals and societies to thrive.
It's a vicious cycle.
The more the state expands its role, more people become dependent on it.
And the more dependent they become, the less capable they are of exercising their own freedom.
Right.
And making choices for themselves.
Sowell sees this as a grave threat, not just to individual flourishing, to the long-term health and vitality of society.
He believes that a culture of dependency ultimately leads to decline and decay.
So Sowell's critique of Marxism isn't just about economics or politics.
No, it's not.
It's about something much deeper. The fundamental relationship between the individual and society, and the conditions that are necessary for human beings to live free and meaningful lives.
That's a key insight.
Sowell argues that freedom in all of its forms, economic, political, and personal,
Right.
isn't just some abstract concept.
It's the essential foundation for individual and societal flourishing.
And he doesn't just make abstract arguments. He anchors his critique in the historical record, pointing to the disastrous outcomes of many Marxist experiments throughout the 20th century.
He cites examples like the Soviet Union's collectivization policies, which led to mass famine,
Right.
and Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, which resulted in the deaths of millions.
These are tragic reminders of what can happen when you try to impose utopian visions on reality,
Right.
without any regard for individual rights and
The
freedoms.
human cost is simply staggering.
Sowell uses these historical examples to underscore his point. Restricting individual liberty, even when it's done with seemingly good intentions, can have catastrophic consequences.
It's a sobering lesson that we need to keep in mind as we face our own complex challenges in the 21st century.
We can't afford to be seduced by simplistic solutions that promise easy fixes to deeply rooted problems.
Sowell's work is a powerful reminder. The road to a more just and equitable world must be paved with respect for individual freedom, not its suppression.
Sowell's analysis raises some profound and timely questions about the nature of freedom, the pursuit of equality, and the proper role of government in society.
What can we learn from his insights?
And how can we apply them to the world we live in today?
We'll explore those questions in more depth in the final part of our deep dive.
We've been unpacking Thomas Sowell's powerful critique of Marxism, exploring its consequences for individual freedom, and the unforeseen problems that can arise from those attempts to engineer society from the top down.
So I think one of the key takeaways from Sowell's work is this importance of being skeptical of those grand utopian schemes that promise to solve all of society's problems.
It's tempting to believe that, if we just restructure society in a certain way, all our problems will magically disappear.
But Sowell cautions us against that kind of simplistic thinking. He shows us through historical analysis and economic reasoning that even the best intentions can go astray. Policies that ignore the complexities of human nature and the incentives that drive human behavior can backfire and lead to unintended consequences.
Instead of striving for some idealized vision of perfect equality that may be impossible to achieve, maybe we should focus on creating a system that gives everyone the opportunity to succeed based on their own efforts and talents.
That's a core element of Sowell's philosophy, I think. He believes that a society that truly values individual liberty and responsibility is much more likely to achieve both prosperity and justice.
It's about empowering individuals to make their own choices and create their own destinies,
Right.
not trying to engineer outcomes from the top down.
That emphasis on individual agency and responsibility is especially important in our world today,
Yeah.
where there's a growing tendency to look to the government to solve every problem.
Sowell reminds us that the government isn't always the solution. In fact, as we've seen in many cases, government intervention can sometimes make things worse.
That's why Sowell stresses the importance of limiting the power of the government and safeguarding individual rights.
He sees these principles as crucial for preventing tyranny and ensuring that power remains in the hands of the people.
It's about finding that delicate balance between individual freedom and collective action.
We need a system that provides a safety net for those who need it,
Right.
without stifling the creativity and initiative of individuals.
That's a challenge that every society has to grapple with.
Yeah.
And it requires constant vigilance to make sure that we're not sacrificing individual liberty in the pursuit of other goals,
Right.
no matter how well-intentioned they may seem.
If we had to distill Sowell's critique of Marxism down to one essential message, it would be this: freedom matters.
Freedom matters.
It matters for individuals, and it matters for society as a whole.
And it's not just economic freedom that matters,
Right.
but freedom in all of its dimensions. political freedom, social freedom, and intellectual freedom.
Restricting freedom in any of these areas not only limits our material well-being, but also diminishes our very humanity.
Sowell reminds us that freedom isn't just a means to an end. It's an end in itself.
It's the foundation of human dignity and a prerequisite for a flourishing society.
So as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, let's keep Sowell's insights in mind.
Let's be wary of utopian promises and those simplistic solutions that sound good in theory, but often fail in practice.
And let's never take our freedoms for granted because they're the foundation of everything we value.
Sowell challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to defend the principles that are essential for a free and just society.
That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive.
We hope this exploration of Thomas Sowell's work has given you some food for thought.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to dive deeper into other complex and important topics, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning,